Hi, welcome to the Rittner Floral School in Boston, Mass. I'm Dr. Steve Rittner, and it's a pleasure to welcome you into one of our classrooms today. We have a very neat lesson planned for you, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy it because what we're going to be dealing with in this brief lesson is a subject that has become very popular as of recent times. It has to do with what's often called the scavenged look or the foraged look in floral designing. Now, I think that this is an interesting idea. The concept sounds good in theory. In practice, it has some issues. The idea is you go out into the woods or you go out on land that happens to have lots of things growing and you kind of forage for different things that you can use in your designs, or you scavenge and you find odds and ends that are out there. It sounds great, but it has some issues. I think that the major issues are twofold. Number one, I would not want to go foraging on any property that doesn't belong to me or that doesn't belong to family or friends and you're doing it without permission. In other words, if you're going to forage or if you're going to take cuttings from a property, it has to be with permission and knowledge of the people who own that property. And I think that that is a very important concern. The second concern has to do with safety. You don't know what you're getting out there. In other words, it may look great, but is it something that is safe to work with? And if you're not really knowledgeable about the various kinds of botanicals that you're dealing with, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble. Emergency rooms are filled with stories of people who forage out in the fields or in the woods and then come in with all kinds of issues like amazing cases of poison ivy and things like that because they were foraging but not really knowledgeable about what they were handling. Having said that, I think that the look is an interesting look, and I think that you can come up with a so-called foraged look in floral art and come up with some very cool things as long as you are very careful about the circumstances under which you're doing it. In other words, there are materials we can get from floral wholesalers, from markets, things like that. If you want to be daring and go out into the backyard and pick a few weeds, floral designers call it rhodesidia, you certainly can. But I would be very careful about using this look with these particular parameters. Now, we're going to do a foraged look design. And I think you're going to find it interesting because it'll give you an idea of the look. And I think that the look is an interesting one and one that you certainly can play with. To do this, I have a container. I have black foam on it. The reason we're using black foam is because black foam generally minimizes the need for adding any foliage or moss to cover mechanics. And to come up with this look, I did take some things from my backyard. We call it rhodesidia. And I'm taking some of these things and working them in. So these things have an interesting look to it, but I am being very careful in terms of cautioning you, my viewer, in terms of how you handle these kinds of things. In other words, if you do decide you want to use the forage type look, be careful of what you're handling, how you're handling it, where you're getting it from. I'm taking a few things that I took out of my backyard, rhodesidia, and I'm working a general kind of shaping with it. And there are things that you can find that may be vines on your property or things that are growing kind of wild. I think one reason people like this kind of look is it feels kind of wild and drippy and droopy and that kind of thing. And I can appreciate that. So for example, I'm constantly taking things off of my building, like we have some very pretty ivy, and I generally like to take some of the ivy off of my building and work it into things like this because I think that visually it gives a drippy, droopy, interesting kind of an effect. But again, you have to be careful in terms of how you're taking these things and how you're using them. In addition to that, there are other materials that are out there that you can use that will help give you this kind of look and still be things that are fairly reasonable in terms of finding. One item that I strongly suggest and I like to make use of when I'm looking for this particular kind of look, eucalyptus, seeded euc. you never can go wrong with seeded uke. It's an interesting material, and we can get them through floral venues and come up with some very, very interesting kind of results. So I think you can see, my viewer, that when we're doing this particular kind of style, I like the style, but I tend to offer a little bit of caution in terms of how you implement it. So we've got some seeded uke that we're working into our design, and I think that that's an interesting way to start with some of our kind of branchy stuff, ivy, seeded eucalyptus, things that are kind of trailing, dripping, drooping, vines, things of that nature. Now, we're going to mix it with some of our flowers. And there are all kinds of different floral products that you can use when you're doing this kind of look. And one of the kinds of things that I like to do when I'm considering these kinds of arrangements are to come up with a focal point quickly and something that will really draw a lot of interest. And in order to do that, I'm going to use a couple of sunflowers because you can't go wrong. Sunflowers are showy, they're big, people like them. They tend to give a really, really cool effect in our designing. And so with several sunflowers, notice, my viewer, I'm coming up with something that is really interesting for us. It kind of sets the mood for this, it sets the tone, and it looks really, really neat. Now, there are other things that we can play with in terms of our flowers, and one of the things that I like to think in terms of is pick things for these designs that do not feel conventional, things that are particularly good in terms of seasonality. In other words, they come in, they are pretty, you can find them, they look interesting, and therefore they will work very well. For example, we have some marigolds here that we found that are really pretty. We also have some very, very attractive dahlias that are available around this time of the year. And I find that when you're playing with things like marigolds, dahlias, sunflowers, these are non-conventional type things. They add a lot of visual interest to our designs when we're doing this kind of look. And so let's take some of our marigolds and work them in. And these are big ones. You can see they really are giving an awful lot of interest to our design. And I'm taking it, I'm working some coming down, and I'm just going to gradually work some coming around. This is a one-sided piece, but it could be just as easily turned into something that is two-sided if we wanted to. So I'm taking some of these flowers and working them in, and I'm going to continue the process, adding some of these and working them from one side to another. Now, you don't have to follow the exact same sequence, but I think, my viewer, you can see how this is gradually developing. These flowers add a different kind of an effect. I'd say that the so-called foraged look almost feels like the farm to table look. The idea is you're getting it out where it's growing, you're throwing it into a container. You certainly can do these in water-based media, but I find that when I'm teaching this in our school, we will teach both water-based as well as foam-based solutions. But I think that in the course of just trying to come up with a quick effect so that you guys can get a sense of the style and the approach, that something like the black foam works really, really well for us. So notice I've got some of our marigolds worked throughout the design. Now, we do have some of our dahlias, and we happen to have several different varieties available to us that we can play with as far as our designing today. I showed you a minute ago some of these. They're absolutely gorgeous. We also have a few of these too. So we're going to work a few of them in. But this particular variety, I don't have too many of, so I'm going to start with this first. I'll place one over here, and I might take a second one and work it in over here. So in other words, what I'm doing, my viewers, I'm playing with things that are non-traditional, things that are seasonal, things that are kind of off the beaten path in terms of everyday use, and working them into our design. And I think you can see, my viewer, how this really gives us a very, very pretty effect. I only had 3 of these, so I'm working them in more towards the center along with my sunflower. And now at this point, I can start taking some of my other dahlias and start playing with them, working them, coming along from one side to the other and working them in further, because I do have more of these. So I'm going to work them in through the design. This is a very interesting look. As I said, I like the look. It's the way people try to implement it that you have to be careful. In other words, it's a great look to do in your designing, but I would use caution in terms of how I go about doing it. The flowers that I've sourced here are all from local farms, and it gives a very, very pretty look. And the only roadsidea that I have here are a few things that were growing on my property that I think are kind of interesting from that point of view. In other words, I'm using prudence in terms of how I source my materials. I'm going to take a little bit more in terms of my flowers, again, working them in. Is this gorgeous or what? I mean, it really gives a very, very pretty look to my designing. And this one is moving a little, so I'm just going to just shift it over slightly. And I think you can see, my viewer, that we really can come up with some very, very pretty looks when we're going for this kind of forage type look. The look is an interesting look. It's a pretty look. It's something you can do some really cool things with. And I think you can see that this is developing very, very nicely for me. Now, at this point, a few other things that we could play with. There are foliages around that give very, very pretty accents, some of our pittosporum. So I'm going to work a little piece of my pittosporum right here, and then I'm going to work another little accent of my variegated pittosporum over here, so that it gives a very, very pretty effect there. Notice how this is filling in, and it feels kind of wild and untamed. Now, a few other things that we can play with, and this is another thing that I kind of like to do when I'm looking for this kind of look, and that is there are orchids out there that are really, really pretty. Our dendrobium orchids, for example, these are absolutely amazing. They are available very easily in a variety of colors through industry sources. And I'm going to take some of my orchids and I'm going to play with them in my design. In other words, I'm going to make use of materials that I can find that I know are absolutely gorgeous and that will work very, very well for me. Orchids, of course, we can find pretty much throughout the year, and therefore it becomes really kind of a nice type of product that we can source and use in our designing if we're looking for this kind of look in terms of our floral art. As I say to my students, every particular botanical comes with something unique to the design table, and it's good to make use of a variety of different things to come up with interesting effects. There is no one Rittner style. There are many styles out there, and we like to make use of as many of them as we can in order to meet different kinds of needs. So notice, my viewer, what I'm doing here. I'm taking some of my orchids and I'm working it through, and it kind of drips, it droops, it goes in all different directions, and it's really giving us a very, very pretty kind of an effect in our designing. I'm going to deliberately let something kind of go towards a little bit more towards the back of the design and kind of lean forwards on it. In other words, we can come up with some very, very pretty looks when we are playing with some of our materials. So you can see, my viewer, this so-called foraged look is very, very rich looking. It gives us a pretty amazing kind of feel to our design. I could stop at this point, my viewer, but there's one more thing that I would like to add. Typically berries work really well. Hypericum berries are available through floral sources, and they can be a very, very good substitute to give us this kind of a feel. And so I'm taking a few of my hypericum berries and I'm working them in. There are a variety of other berries that we can get, again, through your local markets that will help give you this kind of look, this kind of feel in terms of your designing. And I'm deliberately concentrating this more towards the front part of the design because it's near our focal area and therefore it's very, very apparent. Well, isn't that neat? I think you can see, my viewer, it's a very, very interesting kind of look that we've achieved here. At Rittner's Floral School, we believe that floral designing should be quick, easy, and fun. And I think you can see, my viewer, we've come up with what we call the foraged look, but we were careful in terms of how we did it. We don't take it from properties that we're not allowed on. We have to be very careful in terms of the kinds of materials that we're taking. We don't want to take anything that can cause us problems. At the same token, we noticed that in doing this kind of look, by using combinations of things, foliage that tends to drip and droop, things like our ivies, things like our seeded eucalyptus and other varieties of eucalyptus, we can get this kind of overall drippy droopy effect. By sourcing from local farms and finding things that are very, very seasonally appropriate, sunflowers, dahlias, marigolds, things like that, we can come up with looks that are very, very interesting. And then by making use of things like orchids that we can use, orchids like our dendrobiums that shoot out in all different directions and give our designs a kind of a wild look, it certainly contributes to this effect. And then finally, the use of some of our berries. There are a variety of berries that are available through floral industry resources, things like hypericum berries, viburnum, ilex, there are a whole slew of them, things that you can find that will help you come up with this kind of look. I hope, my viewer, that you enjoyed this brief class here at Rittner's Floral School. This is a very interesting kind of look, and I think that it's the kind of look that you can come up with some very, very cool results on. On behalf of all of us here at Rittner's Floral School, we hope you enjoyed this brief lesson. By all means, go out, experiment with some of the things you can get from local farms to come up with these amazing effects in your floral designing. And keep watching our series, because we have all kinds of very, very cool things that we are putting out there for your enjoyment and benefit. On behalf of all of us here at Rittner's Floral School, I'm Dr. Steve Rittner. We want to thank you for coming in and visiting our school today. Thank you.